As investigators moved the bodies tonight of the 9 victims, they still had no idea who committed the murders. Can you tell us how they were killed?
It appears all were gunshot wounds.
Was it execution style?
Well, we'll reserve comment on that at this point.
7 Buddhist monks, 1 woman, and 1 teenager were found dead around 11:30 this morning. Phil Border's wife discovered the bodies when she went to the temple to give food to the monks.
And all the monks were dead, all of them. Well, I don't know.
Authorities don't know how many people were involved in the massacre of the monks. Detectives say whoever did this just walked into the temple but took no money from a money tree near a prayer room. The Buddhist Temple has been here for 3 years. Worshippers claim the monks spent most of their time praying alone.
The monks don't have nothing against nobody. The monks are everybody's friend. So I can't get nothing out of this.
Investigators have called in Asian gangs.
There was a massacre at a Buddhist temple and monastery on the west side of Phoenix. 9 people were killed, executed actually. I use that term on purpose because the way that they were killed was clearly an execution style killing that took more than 20 minutes to complete, start to finish. So it's something that everybody remembers, is how long it took and how difficult it must have been, not just for the victims. It was difficult to accomplish this. One of the temple workers came to the temple about 10 o'clock in the morning. She and a friend of hers, and their job was to fix lunch for the monks. They did it almost every day. And when they came in, they thought, when they first saw, because they came in the same door that the sheriffs did a little bit later, they thought that the monks were asleep. But what disturbed this lady the most was a nun was lying on the floor with them. And that's absolutely taboo. That couldn't take place. It was something that was so astounding to her that she started screaming, but she didn't know why. The other lady saw the blood, and there was a massive pool of blood because it spread, but it didn't spread far because it was blocked by the bodies. So they both turned around, they ran out. They didn't think to try to call from there. They ran to the closest neighbor's house. And the neighbor dialed 911 for them. And one of these young women, she was in her late 20s, she said to the 911 officer, "They all die, same place. All die, same place." And she went into, began crying. She became quite hysterical after giving that first statement. It was exactly 30 days before they had a viable suspect of any kind. What makes that a startling fact is that this was not a low-level investigation. They created a task force of officers from different agencies, many of them state agencies, the Department of Public Safety for Arizona, the City of Phoenix Police Department, and many others. But notwithstanding that enormous effort, 30 days went by with lots of interviews and tens of thousands of fingerprint tracings taken from the crime scene, blood evidence, forensic evidence of a variety of different kinds, but they had no suspects 30 days later up until September 10th, 1991. Well, they got 2 calls on the same day within an hour apart. The first call was identified on the call lead book, which is a large book that kept track of all leads. This was lead number 510. That call came from a Luke Air Force Base security officer who had just been informed that morning that the sheriff's office in Phoenix, in Maricopa County, was looking for a .22 caliber rifle in connection with this shooting. Unfortunately, by mistake, a memo went out to all the police agencies in the state except Luke Air Force Base, which was the closest one. But because it's an Air Force Police Department, they just weren't on the list. So they didn't know that that the sheriff's office was looking for a .22 caliber rifle. That security officer told the sheriff's deputy that he talked to that they had picked up 2 young kids, high school kids, on base, driving around on base with a .22 caliber rifle in the back seat. And they stopped the kids and interviewed the kids and took the gun away. That was the first call. Their names were Alex Garcia and Jonathan Duty. And so what happened logistically at that point was that a sheriff's deputy went out to the Luke Air Force Base and talked to the same person that he'd earlier talked to on the phone, secured a written copy of their report, and realized that the gun had been given back to these boys. And so he then had the addresses of both boys. They both lived within a mile of the temple. They both went to high school in a small town close to that. And he found one of the two boys. It's the one that had the gun, the .22 rifle. He asked the boy if he knew anything about the murders, and he said no, he didn't. He asked him if he had a .22 rifle, and he said, well, I do, but it's not mine. I borrowed it from another friend. The deputy asked if he could take the rifle for testing, and the boy said, sure. So that officer then, the sheriff's deputy, left there, went back downtown where the sheriff's office had its main office, and announced that he had the murder weapon. He wasn't serious, he was kidding. It was a jocular kind of thing. But he made that announcement, and he was immediately told by the lead detective that all of that's going to be on hold for a little bit because we've got a second call. So lead number 511 had come in just within an hour of the time that he left, and lead number 511 was a police officer from Tucson, Arizona, the Tucson Police Department. That's 140 miles away from Phoenix, or away from Luke Air Force Base anyhow. And he said that they had a John Doe, an anonymous caller, call in just a few minutes earlier and said that he knew who killed those monks up there in Phoenix. And so he was going to have another conversation with him, but he wanted to call in and make sure the sheriff's office up in Phoenix knew about this. So that was the second lead. So they had these 2 leads, 510 and 511. In the meanwhile, we've got the officers traveling at high speeds with red lights glaring all the way from Phoenix to Tucson to talk to the person who'd called in on lead 511. Well, the man in Tucson told the Tucson Police Department that his name was John, which he admitted was an alias. Later, in a second conversation, he told them his name was Kelsey, and then he told him it was Lawrence, and much later, hours later, he told him it was Kelsey Lawrence. By then, the 2 officers, the 2 deputies from Phoenix, had arrived in Tucson and were somewhat surprised to go to his address, which was the Tucson Psychiatric Institute. That's a mental hospital in Tucson. The caller was a patient in the hospital. He didn't work there. He was a patient. He was in there because of relatively serious mental problems. They interviewed him in the presence of one of the hospital nurses, and he told them that he and 4 of his friends, that was the first story, 4, had done these crimes. And he offered to tell them in whatever detail they wanted to know, whatever it is that they wanted to know. They asked him if he wouldn't mind riding back up to Phoenix in the car with them. He wanted to know if they were going to turn the lights and the siren on. They said they weren't sure about that, but once they told him that they might, then he said, fine, let's go. So they got back to Phoenix pretty close to midnight that night. It was a Tuesday night. September the 10th was a Tuesday. And from midnight through the next morning about 8 o'clock, they learned a couple of things. Finally, the wee hours of the morning, 1 or 2 a.m., they learned that the officers learned, who were interrogating him at this point, that he didn't exist. And no such person as Kelsey Lawrence or Lawrence Kelly or Mike Kelsey. He finally admitted that his name was Mike McGraw. So now, late in his first transcript, they're calling him Mike McGraw. And he identified over the next 6 or 7 hours on tape, on audio tape, all of it clear on the tape. He identified 2 different cars, 6 different guns, 8 different people, multiple motives, and multiple fabricated places where they went, none of which was true. The names of the boys were true. They were all friends of his. They lived in the same area, the same part of Tucson, an area called South Tucson, South Park. But none of them, only one of them had ever been here before, but he identified all of them. So they asked him if he would mind going back down to Tucson with them and taking the officers and other officers, because by now they're getting a SWAT team together, to the houses that these other boys lived in. And they weren't boys. One was 19, one was 20, 2 others were in their mid-20s, the oldest was 28. But they all knew one another, and so they were all arrested under somewhat difficult circumstances by SWAT team style arrests. They were all brought back to Phoenix in cars. They were all interrogated in a suite of rooms in the 4th floor of the Maricopa County Superior Courthouse. They had set that up as the task force headquarters. And the short story is, over the next 2.5 days, they interrogated all 5 of these boys. Some of them knew the other boys were there, some of them didn't, but all 5 of them were interrogated. Of that group, 4 of the 5 confessed on audio tape to these crimes, these killings. And they confessed in significant detail, with times and places and colors and shapes and who was in the room and what kind of a gun they had. They testified, confessed on audio tape to all of that, to a tag team of investigators who had taken 2.5 days to accomplish this result. But in the end, it's 5 clear-cut confessions on tape. One person, one of the men, denied that he had any role to play, but the other 4 all implicated him. So they then formally arrested all 5, took them to the court, to the magistrate, charged them with 9 counts of felony murder and first-degree premeditated murder. And once they were charged, this case was classified as a death penalty case, and that started the long process that they would go through. Once that was done, then there was a second round of an investigative effort to try to document and confirm in some way that these 5 young men, 4 of whom admitted the crime, 1 who did not, that they were actually the ones that did it. So they looked for forensic evidence, alibi evidence, testimonial and character references, all the kinds of things that you would do to follow up. The problem was that none of it worked. They all had solid alibis. None of them had police records, with the exception of 1 young man. None of them had been to Phoenix. And they all had recanted their confessions the second they got to the courthouse. They all said, no, we were interrogated and forced to say what they wanted us to say, and we didn't do this. They all 4 said the same thing. While that's going on, they got around to testing the gun. So when they tested the gun, the crime lab, the state crime lab, called immediately, same day they turned the gun in, and said, I don't know where you got this gun, but that's it. It's the murder weapon. There's no question about it. So they immediately went back out where they'd been before now, 7 weeks before. They arrested the 2 boys. In fact, they arrested 3. The third one was a young man named Roland Caratachea, or Raleigh Caratachea, as he was known to his friends. Over the course of, once again, they arrested these people at night, in the 7, 8, 9 p.m. at night. They interrogated all 3 of them in the same rooms, same officers, using the same techniques that they had used on the Tucson 4. And now 2 of these 3 boys, all juveniles, confessed to the same crimes. So all of this became wide public knowledge in Phoenix. And all the press knew, all the media knew, every lawyer in town knew, I was one of them, that there are two different sets of suspects. All of them have confessed, and it can't be the case that they're all guilty because both groups deny the existence of the other group. So at a point late in November of 1991, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office dismissed all the charges against the Tucson 5 young men at that point, and they then focused heavily on the 2 boys that did confess, and there was a fair amount of forensic evidence against one of them. That was Alex Garcia. They had evidence from him that was forensic in nature that could place him at the crime. Besides that, he'd confessed. They had they had no forensic evidence against the other boy, Jonathan Duty. They had a very weak case against him based entirely on his confession. But they couldn't place him at the scene except by Garcia's testimony. So ultimately what happened there was that the prosecutor's office offered a plea bargain to Alex Garcia. And the reason they did that, at least in my opinion, but I got the opinion from the Maricopa County County Attorney. So they gave Garcia a plea bargain because they had a good case against him and they could make it. They didn't have a very good case against Duty. They needed Garcia to testify against Duty. So the plea bargain they offered him was, if you testify against Duty truthfully at trial, then, and if you plead guilty to 9 counts of first-degree premeditated murder, we will take the death penalty off the table. That's all they were willing to do, was to take the death penalty off the table. This is a 16-year-old boy. Many would say he's not likely to get the death penalty anyhow, but whatever the case may be, they took that off the table. He agreed. He testified against Duty at trial. They never offered a plea bargain to Duty, and they had no forensic evidence against him. What they did have is his confession. But his confession, he limited it to the fact that he admitted to being there at the temple with Garcia, and he said with Carachea as well. And during that time period, that's all they had, was his admission of being physically there. So that's the case that went to the trial, and it went to trial in the summer of 1993. They tried that case for about 7 weeks over a 3-month period of time. At the end of the trial, the jury had to determine whether or not Jonathan Duty was guilty or not. They had no role to play in Garcia's case, but Garcia, of course, was the prime witness, the only witness against Duty. So they had to test Garcia's credibility, not against Duty's testimony, because Duty did not testify at trial. They did play his very long 17 audio tape interrogation to the jury. So the jury heard all of that, but what they got out of that is all that there was to get, which is, I was there, I didn't shoot anybody, I didn't kill anybody, I didn't have anything to do with these killings. I wasn't even in the room when it happened, but I was there at the temple. So against that, they returned a verdict of guilty, unanimous verdict of guilt on felony murder only, and they acquitted him on first-degree premeditated murder. And the only explanation for that can be that they thought Garcia was the shooter, not Duty. And so they rejected Garcia's testimony. He wasn't before them as a defendant, but he was certainly before them as a witness. The other thing that happened during the trial that made it a very unusual trial was that the defense lawyer for Jonathan Duty, a very able lawyer named Peter Balkin, Mr. Balkin called 2 of the Tucson 4 to the witness stand in the Duty case. And he read in evidence, he didn't read it, but he submitted in evidence the transcript of the confessions of all 4. The argument that he successfully made to the judge was, what what better evidence could I possibly have of the innocence of my client but the audio tape confessions and the written confessions, the transcripts of the confessions of 4 other people who say they actually committed the crime that my client denies he committed. So all the Tucson 4 testimony came in evidence. All the officers who participated in the interrogations were called as witnesses during the trial. And the culmination of all of that enormous effort was that Jonathan Duty was found guilty only of felony murder and acquitted of first-degree premeditated murder. But it was a capital case at that time. So under our law at the time, under Arizona law at the time, capital sentences were handed down by judges after a hearing. They weren't handed down by juries. Today they're handed down by juries. But in 1991 it was done by the judge. So he conducted a capital mitigation aggravation hearing for Jonathan Duty. And at the end of that fairly long hearing, it was 6 or 7 days, he rejected the state's demand for the death penalty, and he sentenced Jonathan Duty to 271 years in prison on 9 different counts. Each of the actual counts were to be served consecutively. So the end result was 271 years. Then he sentenced Alex Garcia on his plea of guilty, and he sentenced Garcia to 261 years. So their terms, imprisonment terms, were 10 years apart. That, of course, started an appellate process. So in May of 2011, the Court of Appeals ordered that the state of Arizona either release Jonathan Duty from its Department of Corrections from prison or give him a new trial. And the state elected to give him a new trial. So that's where the case stands today. That order came down in May of 2011. It's taken some time now. I think the current prediction is that a new trial for Jonathan Duty will be held in Phoenix, Arizona, in the Maricopa County Superior Court sometime in the summer of 2013, this coming summer. That's where the case stands today.